towards the government in the government's favour. So we have the three, Ian Paisley, these three Democratic Unionists, who have already said they'll be abstaining. Now, we've now watched the Ulster Unionists, the bigger bloc under David Trimble. They'll be meeting later this evening.
These are the 9 crucial votes, really, aren't
Very
they?
much so. But no one at Westminster is going to be surprised now if those 9 votes decide to vote together to abstain. Equally, no one can be quite sure what the Ulster Unionists are going to do until they finally do it. So that's very much, as you say, the wild card in the deck. But of course, the betting in the Tory whip's office, on the Labour side too, is they may well abstain.
The difficulty for this, for some of the Conservative waverers, some of those who really feel passionately about this and would like to vote against the government, is that they want to inflict a blow, but not a fatal one. And people like Rupert Allison, I suspect, are rather anxious to see that the government will survive. That would enable them to vote against. It's going to be very difficult for them to assess this, isn't it?
Well, that's right. We started a few days back with a crop of maybe half a dozen potential Conservative rebels declaring themselves to that effect. But Rupert Allison, the one you mentioned, feels very strongly about this, but he's equally now making clear that if the government comes up with the right sort of emollient tone and makes it clear they've learned the lessons to be learned from the Arms to Iraq affair, he's prepared to listen. And we confidently expect the Minister to take that emollient tone and to spell out some of the ways in which the lessons have been learned.
The government has suggested there are going to be some real concessions this afternoon. Do you think they're going to be important ones?
There will be concessions, in quotes. I think some of them may be rather more glossy than substantial. For example, what do we confidently expect? We expect something of a shake-up of the use of intelligence material in Whitehall. Now, that review has been in train for several months, since well through the Scott inquiry. We expect some action to tighten up export controls. Again, action's been taken, more may follow. We expect the Minister to talk more about tightening up, looking at ministerial accountability to the House of Commons. A fairly vague concept, that, and I wonder if at the end of it, or even at the beginning, we'll be much further forward in terms of concrete progress.
We shall see. John, thank you very much. Let's go then to those questions to the Deputy Prime Minister. They began this afternoon's sessions, and MPs wasted not a moment in talking about Scott. First up was Labour's David Winnick, who'd asked Mr Heseltine what assessment he had made of arrangements for presenting policy, and been told, to laughter from Labour benches, that presentation of policy continued to go from strength to strength.
But in presenting government policy on the Scott report, does the Deputy Prime Minister, is the Deputy Prime Minister going to explain why he had so much misgivings about signing the public interest immunity certificates? And why is the Deputy Prime Minister so keen to defend the Attorney General when the Attorney did not pass on those misgivings to the court, or the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister, then the President of the Board of Trade, was quite anxious that those documents in question should be released to the court? Wouldn't it be better if the Deputy Prime Minister now explains the position fully?
Yeah. Well, I'm most grateful, John, remember, for a chance to do so. The Attorney General gave me the clearest advice. He said that the papers in front of me would be considered by the judge, who would determine whether or not they should be released. It would be interesting if, whenever one is trying to give a serious answer in this House, one wasn't barracked from a sedentary position by honourable members opposite. This is an extremely important matter, and I was giving a serious answer to the honourable member who asked a serious question. He's entitled to an answer, and I'm going to give it to him. The fact is, I was given advice by the Attorney General that the papers would be considered by the judge, and if he considered it appropriate, they would be released. The judge did consider the papers. He did think they should be released. They were released. The trial proceeded on that basis, and 2 of the defence counsel at that time said they thought the attorney had behaved properly.
Could we just get the government's policy absolutely clear? Is it that the Deputy Prime Minister was wrong in requiring a certificate set out in a special form and requiring his reservations to be passed on to the judge, which they were not? Or was he right, and were other ministers wrong not to do that?
That is another very serious question. I will try to answer it. The fact is, I agreed a certificate with the Attorney General that related to the papers in front of me in the Department of Trade and Industry. We both agreed that certificate, I signed it, and it was therefore the basis of the judgment that both the Attorney and I reached in those circumstances. It is not relevant to my colleagues in other departments, because they were signing certificates about papers in their departments only available to them. And it is absolutely fundamental to understand that when ministers are invited to sign PIIs of any sort, they are only signing them in respect of the papers in front of them that relates to their particular department.
The Deputy Prime Minister. And here on our front bench is David Howell, the former Foreign Minister, who will be supporting Mr Major in the big debate this afternoon. Here too is Quentin Davis, one of the Conservative MPs who's declared against the government, and he's an improbable ally now of Labour's Barbara Roach, a lawyer and member of the Trade and Industry Select Committee, and Nick Harvey, the Lib Dem spokesman on Trade and Industry, who'll be speaking as one of the Lib Dem spokesmen in the debate this afternoon. Quentin Davis, let me start with you. Is it ministerial heads that you're after in voting against your own party?
No, what I'm after is that we should accept the fact, it's an undeniable fact, that Parliament was misled. It was misled on the question of the criteria for determining arms exports to Iran and Iraq, whether or not Iran and Iraq were treated even-handedly and so forth. Those individual matters aren't important. What is important is that Parliament was misled. It was systematically misled over a period of many months by a whole lot of misleading letters and answers to parliamentary questions. We can't just accept that. We can't just forget about it. We can't just vote to adjourn the House tonight as if none of that matters. It matters desperately, because if the principle is established, if the precedent is established, that if ministers are seen to have misled the House, we've had the whole apparatus of the Scott report to demonstrate what the facts are, and still nothing happens, then I'm afraid that in the future no one will really believe in the accountability of ministers to Parliament. And what is more, I think people won't believe in the basic integrity of British public life to the extent that they have done in the past.
Nick Harvey was nodding agreement with you there, but some of your own colleagues in the Conservative Party have been saying, look, this is out of sour grapes. This is because you didn't get the ministerial position you wanted. This isn't out of really pure ethics.
Well, you must be joking. I mean, if you were privy to some of the conversations I've had in the last few days, which I certainly can't reveal, you would know that the very opposite is the case, so far as my own career is concerned. Far from it.
They've been trying to bribe you back on board with ministerial offers?
No, I'm not going into any of that at all. I'm simply saying that that is far from the case, very far from the case. I was shocked and horrified and very worried when I began to read the Scott report. And when I appreciated what had really been happening.
But you see, if you take somebody like George Warden, who's been writing in the London Evening newspaper today, the Evening Standard, now he's not known as being a government toady, if you like. He's been saying, look, come off it. What's all this about? Bribery, conspiracy, illicit pressure from military-industrial complex? No, it's all much more mundane. It's because scrupulous government people, one of the most scrupulous government machines in the Western world, as he puts it, was trying in its earnest, meticulous way to reconcile the impossible, to stand by its self-imposed embargo on Iraq and simultaneously to keep thousands of citizens in jobs.
Nick, it's, I'm afraid, all too tempting in these situations to talk about something else, to try to avoid facing the main issue. That has been the great temptation which the government has faced over the last few days. I can understand why it's very tempting not to want to confront reality, not to want to confront the hard truth that Parliament was misled. But we have to face that. We have to grapple with that, or else we'll do permanent damage to our Constitution, permanent damage to the position of Parliament and the Constitution, permanent damage, as I said, to the whole integrity of the system. We can't just forget about it. And we've got to concentrate on this. So I, this afternoon, in the debate, if I get called, I shan't be addressing all these other issues. Some of them are important, very important, some of them less so. But nothing is more important than the basic integrity of our institutions.
Now, there are other Conservative colleagues of yours who feel very strongly as you do. But many of them, as I was suggesting earlier to John Pienaar, want to inflict a blow, but not a decisive, not too damaging a one. What's going to happen? Have you discussed, you must have discussed this with some of your colleagues. Are others going to walk into the opposition lobby with you?
I don't know, Nick. The way our system works and the way it should work is that we're all elected to Parliament because we're trusted by our constituents to take decisions, and sometimes there'll be difficult decisions, on their behalf, to use our best judgment. All of us have got to look at the evidence, confront the evidence open-mindedly and as honestly as we can, and come to conclusions. So what I do is my responsibility, and I'm responsible to my constituents. Other colleagues must take their own views.
How far would you push it? Just supposing the government was defeated, and the Prime Minister said, OK, well, it's too late for the order paper tomorrow, but on Wednesday we'll come back with a motion of confidence. Will you then vote in favour of the government?
Well, you see, Nick, another fundamental constitutional principle in this country for the last 300 years has been that ministers hold office because they only when they have the confidence of the House of Commons. if they lose the confidence of the House of Commons, they can no longer hold office. It's clear, therefore, that the government lost the vote tonight, that the position, for example, Mr. Waldegrave, would be untenable. So a ministerial resignation would be inevitable. At that point, of course, the problem would have been addressed and solved, not in the way that I would have wished, but in a very classical way, the traditional way. Somebody would have taken responsibility. We would have made it absolutely plain that not only is it unacceptable to mislead the House of Commons, but it had not been accepted on this occasion. On the 26th of February 1996, it's extremely important that we come away tonight with that principle re-established beyond a shadow of doubt.
David Howell, you're defending the government in this, but do you not accept what Quentin Davis has just been saying? The House was systematically misled, even if the intentions were good.
No, I don't. I think this is full of fantasy and misunderstanding. I mean, I'm 1/650th of the House of Commons. I lived through these times. I don't feel misled. We knew exactly what was happening. It's never, never, never been the aim or the practice of government and ministers to tell the House of Commons every detail of arms supplies. The Labour government in 1945 didn't tell the House of Commons every detail about building up the atom bombs.
Clear implication from the Scott report is that the House, Geoffrey says the House was misled.
Well, I'm afraid, I mean, there's very able people doing this report, but I don't think they understand actually, as some of us who've been there for many years perhaps understand, and certainly history would tell us, how accountability really works. Accountability is not just through parliamentary answers, not even through letters to MPs. Accountability is through finding out and knowing what is going on, and often not wishing it to be stated publicly on a public platform, which is what stating it in Parliament means. This applies to every range, particularly of dealings in foreign policy, and particular to supplies of weapons. And ministers, I mean, my good friend Peter Shaw, whose judgment I think is superb on these matters, told the House of Commons in '74, as a senior minister, that it was not the practice of government to inform the House of Commons on every detail of arms supplies. And I would be horrified if it was. The policy was there. The policy obviously was going to be modified at the end of the war. There was no misleading in that sense, and I think these noble lawyers have got it wrong, and I'm afraid Quentin's got it wrong as well.
You're suggesting it's not just Quentin who's got it wrong, you're suggesting Sir Richard has been naive.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I mean, if you look at the report, and I confess I haven't read every word, and it's a pretty turgid thing to read, but I've read quite a lot. It's a very interesting piece of lawyers' work, but for instance, they don't go into all the issues of Middle Eastern policy, with its vast complexities, our relations with the Saudis and other Gulf states, the flow of commerce and the intertwining of commerce, and indeed people's lives at risk. None of that is examined in this report. The whole thing is left out as though it wouldn't be, as though it wasn't of any importance. It's extraordinary.
Can I come back quickly? Because I think David has fallen into exactly the trap I was describing earlier. He finds it very painful to confront the reality, and therefore is talking about something else. No one's protesting that in certain cases the government can say that it's not in the national interest to discuss certain aspects of policy in public at all. I would most happily accept that. And the other things he mentions are not relevant to the issue. But Parliament was misled. We have here on page 475, volume 1, Mr. Waldegrave knew firsthand the facts that, in my opinion, rendered the no change in policy statement untrue. Look at these responses of William Waldegrave. The government have not changed their policy on defence sales to Iraq or Iran. Absolute nonsense. Anybody reading that or seeing that at the time would have had a quite false impression of reality. Our firm and even-handed position over arms sales to Iran.
But you're saying that Scott's being naive, because even if these are correct, your view is that he's not understanding the complexity of being in ministerial position.
He says, in my opinion, he's obviously hedging his position. It's his opinion, and I'm saying his opinion in these things is wrong.
Naive.
Yes,
now,
and naive, and also fails to comprehend two things. First of all, that the policy actually stayed the same. Secondly, that we were not misled. We knew perfectly well that at the end of the Iran-Iraq conflict and the ceasefire, it would have been absolutely essential for there to be modifications in the interpretation of the policy. And thirdly, that was done, and most of us knew it. We weren't misled.
Can I just ask you,
we just weren't misled.
The Prime Minister was challenged by Mr. Blair at PMQs a couple of weeks ago, and I think on 2 occasions now. Would he stand by the report, not just that it was done with integrity, but that the way it was done was right? And the Prime Minister was very careful not to endorse it in that manner. Is that because your views are widely held on government
That
ventures?
I don't know. My views are my views. I've lived through this period. I've listened to and read endless exchanges on the way that Mr. Scott, Richard Scott and Presley Baxendale conducted things. It was very able. But of course it was the prosecutional style not designed to get at the truth.
Right.
It doesn't. In truth withers, it becomes the victim, not the objective, under that kind of cross-examination. And also these were very experienced people in the legal world who do not understand the full ideas, dimensions of accountability. He speaks of a concept, of the constitutional concept of accountability of ministers to Parliament. That is a very, very broad concept, ranging far wider than PQs and ministers' letters to MPs. There is no understanding of that in any word or any paragraph in the report that I can find.
Nick, can I just quite clearly
Barbara,
say
you
this?
should say Quentin Davis had to get across the road back into the chamber.
Yes. I mean, Nick, this is, you know, David's doing his best, but this is quite clearly nonsense. What are the charges and what did Sir Richard Scott find? First of all, and most importantly, he found that Parliament had been deliberately misled. That's a very, very serious charge. Every minister holds office on the basis of the confidence of the House.
It's a
and the most
serious
serious
charge if it was
offence you can do,
intentional.
the most serious offence you can do is to mislead the House. Quite clearly, when the parliamentary questions were answered, William Wardgrave knew quite clearly that what he was answering did not reflect the position of the time, and also that Sir Richard Scott found two other things: that the guidelines were changed and that any other explanation is mere sophistry, and also there was no excuse whatsoever for these public interest immunity certificates to be used in criminal cases. They've never ever been used in the past, and the liberty of the subject was at risk.
You make it sound so clear-cut. But if you
It
read the Scott report, and I have as much as I could, and it takes an awful lot of doing, it isn't clear-cut. It's very, very complex, and it does seem that you're not making the charges stick, and certainly Sir Richard was not convinced that these charges in the black and white way that you put it did stick.
The more I think that one reads the Scott report, and I think that's quite clearly true of what Quentin Davis has quite rightly said, the more it adds up to a damning indictment of this government and of government policy. The charges are made to stick, and the valuableness of Sir Richard's report is he goes into everything in very, very great detail indeed. But on the central charges of misleading Parliament and using public interest immunity certificates in a criminal case, which has never ever been done before, never been done by a Labour government, never been done by Conservative governments in the past, the charges are found to be proved.
Nick Harvey, I don't doubt that you and Barbara Roach feel strongly about this and about the genuine ethics of it. On the other hand, this is also plain politics, isn't it? If these had been people on your side of the fence who'd made what you might regard as errors of judgment, you'd have written them off as errors of judgment. The fact is, you are trying to pursue the government, you want to see the government defeated, and this is just a tactic and opportunity to do it, isn't it?
Well, I think the public can actually see through the politics of the issue and can actually see, lying beneath that, the fact that the government has been found to have misled the House of Commons deliberately over a period of time. And if this is just allowed to stand, and if David Howell and John Major and the rest of them are able just to brush it all aside, where does this leave us? It leaves us with knowing misleading of the House of Commons officially sanctioned and declared to be in order and acceptable constitutional principle for everyone to adhere to. And I think that leaves our democratic system completely flawed.
Do you think your constituents actually care about public immunity certificates, as it's turned out that he was able to say that it didn't damage the courtroom proceedings?
I think that the public do care about this, and that the Scott report may appear contradictory because in different places it finds different charges to have either been supported or not, but they do appreciate that overall he found that the government had not handled this as well as it should. And we need the government to say we were wrong. However so that they choose to do it, they have to accept some responsibility before we can clean the decks down and rebuild anything to come in its place.
Thank you all very much. We'll see in just a moment whether the government is prepared to do that. As 2 or 3 minutes of the debate is due to start, let's quickly go back and hear a few more of the exchanges about the Scott report that happened a few minutes ago during questions to the Deputy Prime Minister.
When all the millions of words have been said and written about the Scott report, isn't the irreducible truth that ministers, and I put it in its kindest way, deliberately withheld information from the House? As this is the clearest possible abuse of our parliamentary system, and indeed it's difficult to see how the system can operate if that abuse is allowed to continue, will the Deputy Prime Minister publicly now, on behalf of the government, without reservation or without qualification, apologise to the House?
When the Scott's report is considered in its totality, the overriding conclusion will be is that the allegations peddled by the Parliamentary Labour Party for 3 years were unfounded. We did not arm Saddam Hussein, and we did not conspire to send innocent men to prison. And the Parliamentary Labour Party and its spokesman should apologise unreservedly for those charges.
Madam Speaker, would my right honourable friend agree with me that the Scott report argues in a number of different directions at the same time, and it's impossible to take it finally seriously for that reason?
I have seen it said of the Scott report that it is biblical in its judgments. There is something there to suit most people, depending on which quotation they use. But the facts remain that the central charges against the government have not been proved by the Scott report.
Dennis Skinner.
Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware that now he's got this newfangled machine in the biggest office in Whitehall, and the new titles, Deputy Prime Minister and First Secretary of State, which is screwed out of the Prime Minister on the day of the ballot? Does he think if he'd have had that machine and he'd have been in that position at the time when the arms sales were taking place, that he would have been able to use this spying machine to enable him to tell all those cabinet ministers, look, you're going down the wrong track? Does he think it would have worked?
Well, I think that as so often with the honourable member, he's out of touch with his own party. There's only one big lie machine been introduced in modern politics recently, and that's in Millbank, and it's been put there by the Labour Party.
But at the moment, the Commons is hearing questions on the church commissioners. We've just been listening to Tony Banks a few moments ago on his feet. Let's go to the Commons live now and hear the answer, hear what's going on just before the major debate starts. Our correspondent is Carolyn Quinn.
Yes, thanks, Nick. And those questions to Michael Allison representing the church commissioners now coming to an end. The chamber in the past few moments has been filling up. Most of the main players are in their seats now. The Attorney General, Sir Nicholas Lyle, and William Waldegrave on the front bench. The Prime Minister's just taken his seat as well. And the President of the Board of Trade, who is due to open the debate, has also taken his place. As you've just seen as well, the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, has already been doing his bit to reinforce the government line. Now, it looks like we have a number of points of order before we get on to the debate. This is Andrew McKinley for Labour.
Page 119 and page 128 of the 21st edition of Erskine May. It relates to the influencing of members. And in particular on page 128, where it says attempts to improperly influence members, it refers to the fact of the resolution of the House of Commons of 1695, where it says the offer of money or other advantage to any member of Parliament for the promoting of any matter whatsoever, depending or to be transacted in Parliament, is a high crime and misdemeanour, and tends to be the subversion of the English Constitution. Erskine May goes on in its current edition to say that the offering to a member of Parliament of any fee or reward in order to influence him in his conduct as a member in the connection of the promotion of or opposition of any bill, resolution or matter of things submitted or intended to be submitted to the House or committee
Order!
thereof.
I'm quite capable of reading, and the honourable gentleman has given me the pages. What is his point of order now?
Madam Speaker, it does seem to me that if an extraordinary package is put together for one honourable member, a Conservative member, in order so that he can avoid disqualification from the House, must be a matter which could unduly influence the member in his conduct. Indeed, it goes to the heart of the matter, because if that package has been put together exclusively to keep him in the House, it affects his conduct. And therefore, Madam Speaker, I would ask you to consider whether or not such a package is lawful, and secondly, whether or not such package clearly has to be declared in the Register of Members' Interests.
The honourable member believes it may be a question of privilege. Then, of course, he shall write to me, and I will consider it in that light. If he believes it's a question for standards of this House, we have a Commissioner for Standards, and he should write to the Commissioner for Standards. If he is not at all clear in his own mind, if he will write to me, I'll be glad to sort him out.
In brief, that was a reference to the Conservative MP Roy Thomason. There was speculation that he was facing bankruptcy, and there have been stories that there's been a campaign to raise money to get him out of that state.
The sign and value, of course, I've given her a courtesy note of what I was going to say this afternoon. At the weekend, Madam Speaker, a well-wisher gave me a letter from the Honourable Lady, which you, Madam Speaker, have a copy of, and it is to Conservative constituency chairmen throughout the country, urging them to urge their members of Parliament to vote against the Scott report. Well, of course, that is a matter for the Honourable Lady. The difficulty, as I see it, Madam Speaker, is that it's on House of Commons notepaper. The added difficulty as well, Madam Speaker, that it's on a prepaid House of Commons. Now, I make no political points, Madam Speaker, but I would seek your guidance.
Referring to the Labour MP Anne Cleward.
I would ask the honourable gentleman if he would refer it to the Sergeant-at-Arms. He's been kind enough to let me have a copy of the document to which he refers. The Sergeant-at-Arms will be carrying out an inquiry. If he would let him have any information that he have, it would help with that inquiry. Order. The honourable lady has been mentioned. Mrs. Cleward.
Madam Speaker, thank you. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for writing to me to say that he was going to raise this point of order, Madam Speaker. However, I could not understand his writing. I'd be very grateful next time if he's writing to me that he either joins up his letters or types his letters. I find it very difficult to take seriously a point made by the honourable gentleman. An honourable gentleman who is prepared to take the whole of
being referred to the Sergeant-at-Arms, it is quite right that I hear the honourable lady was being accused. Mrs. Cleward.
An honourable gentleman who is prepared to bring the whole of Parliament into disrepute by dressing up as a French maid and all sorts of other antics.
Referring to some of Jerry Hayes's activities outside Parliament, usually involving media appearances.
I think we're now going to... order. You will look very pretty as a French maid. I wish I had your curls. They're getting up.
Jerry Hayes trying to respond.
We're now moving into the adjournment debate, and I have to tell the House that there will be speeches limited to 10 minutes from all back benches. Prime Minister...
I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
Question is House to now adjourn? Mr. Secretary Lamb.
So now the debate proper begins.
Madam Speaker, the House will welcome the opportunity afforded by this debate to consider Sir Richard Scott's report now that all honourable members have had the opportunity to study it. That was why the government deliberately allowed 10 clear days to elapse between publication and debate. We welcome the central conclusions of the report that there was no plot secretly to arm Saddam Hussein and no attempt to suppress documents which could have led to a miscarriage of justice. Those issues were central to the inquiry. But today I want to look forward. I want to look in detail and with care at Sir Richard Scott's recommendations and criticisms as he asked the government to do. The report... I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful. Just before he leaps forward, could he tell the public, does he accept the findings of Scott in sections D4 and D8 that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury deliberately and designedly misled Parliament? Those are Scott's words, Madam Speaker. If he does, how can the Chief Secretary remain with any honour in the Cabinet?
With respect to the honourable gentleman, Madam Speaker, those were not Sir Richard Scott's words. But if the honourable gentleman contains his soul in patience, I shall try to cover all points of relevance as I proceed. The report rightly focused... Now, I think I really must get started on my speech. The report rightly focused on the serious and defamatory charges that had been made and of which the government now stands acquitted. But in my statement 10 days ago,
I also took care to draw attention to Sir Richard Scott's criticisms, to which I referred repeatedly, and to his conclusions and recommendations, on which I would like today to indicate more of the government's thinking. To recap on my earlier remarks, mistakes were made. There are lessons to be learned. The government has accepted the inquiry's criticisms concerning the distribution of intelligence material and has already taken action to improve it. We have accepted the criticism about export controls and licensing procedures and have already undertaken to publish a consultation paper on that, as Sir Richard Scott recommends. We have already undertaken to consider further and very carefully his comments on the use of wartime export control legislation. We accept the principle of the need now for greater supervision by the Office of the Attorney General of Customs and Excise prosecutions in relation to export control matters, and I shall say more on that. We also accept many of his other recommendations. I would like to address these recommendations, including in particular, well, if I give way now to the honourable gentleman, I will not be able to give way later.
Does the Minister accept the central conclusion of Sir Richard Scott's report that policy was changed and this change in policy was deliberately kept from Parliament?
No, I do not, Madam Speaker. There is a difference. There is a difference between the government and Sir Richard on that matter, but I do accept the two central conclusions of Sir Richard Scott's report on the question of secretly arming Saddam Hussein and of the question of gagging the courts and risking the imprisonment of innocent men. But I would like to address the recommendations that I have mentioned, including in particular the issues of openness in government and accountability to Parliament. No, I must make some progress, if the honourable gentleman will allow me. As I said in my statement, there is a continuing line of criticism running through the report of the conventions long established in this House, whereby successive governments have undervalued, as Sir Richard Scott sees it, the public interest in the disclosure of information. This government has a good record in improving openness in government, and the debate on how much further openness in Parliament might go should be seen in that context. For example, we have introduced or supported numerous measures opening up for the first time specific areas of government, even the most sensitive, as with the Intelligence Service Act 1994. More generally, we published the first white paper on open government in 1993 and the code of practice it proposed a year later. As a result of all this and of other Citizens' Charter initiatives, another first for this government, there is now much more information released, whether on the background to government decisions, on medical and other records, or on school, hospital and local government performance data. Over 48,000 previously confidential public records have now been released. It was under this government that the new departmental select committee system was introduced in 1979 as a major step towards more open and accountable government. We have avowed for the first time the Secret Intelligence Service and put it on a statutory footing and subject to a statutory oversight committee. This government has also published, the first to do so, detailed lists of ministerial cabinet committees and questions of procedure for ministers, both causes dear to the heart of the Right Honourable Member for Chesterfield, to whom such openness was denied by the last Labour government.
Referring to Tony Benn.
The issues of foreign policy and export controls, in 1991, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Social Security, then my predecessor at the Department of Trade and Industry, took the unprecedented step of publishing the detailed lists, 70 pages in all, of the exports licensed for Iraq between 1987 and 1990. But despite the good record of this government, I hope we can go further down the route of open government. Further, as we have already gone, than in the traditional answer that I quoted to the House 10 days ago to questions on defence sales when answered by the Labour government in the 1970s, when the Right Honourable Member for Bethnal Green and Stepney said, "It has been the policy of successive governments not to reveal information on the supply of arms to individual countries." Further, too, than the answer given by his honourable friend, the member for Oldham West, who said, and I quote, "The list of recipient countries is not published because defence purchases are regarded as confidential." I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Equal to the Minister for giving way. A year ago, I was given a misleading answer to a parliamentary question. And since then, after a great deal of pressure from my right honourable friends on the front bench, I have received an apology which was printed in Hansard on the 9th of February. Why is it that when Sir Richard Scott has recognised, and the government recognised, so many misleading and false parliamentary answers have been given, that no apology has yet been made to any of the members concerned?
Well, Sir Richard Scott has identified answers which he concludes are misleading, but he has also recognised that they were given in good faith by ministers who thought that they were accurate. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for having the courtesy to inform me that he was likely to mention my name. Indeed, I'm inclined to think that no ministerial speech will be complete in recent days and in recent weeks without some mention of the fact that as Secretary of State for Trade, I stated clearly and with agreement the doctrine that we did not give information about exports of defence and weapons equipment to other countries. That's made very good sense. But that isn't the issue, if I may say to the right honourable gentleman. The issue is whether we should, this is the basic issue, have been supplying the amounts of defence-related equipment that we did to the two most odious regimes in the world.
Well, that is an issue that I shall come to shortly, Madam Speaker. At the moment, I'm addressing the question of openness in government, the conventions in this House which have been observed by successive governments, including the ones of which the honourable gentleman was a member. Madam Speaker, Erskine May. Yes, of course, I give way to my honourable friend.
Is my right honourable friend aware, following a previous intervention, that I myself was sent a letter by our right honourable friend? Is he further aware that I was not in any way misled by that letter, and that I wrote to inform Sir Richard Scott that this was the case? The Minister told me on the 4th of May that the guidelines were applied on a case-by-case basis in the light of prevailing circumstances, including the ceasefire. Those were not tablets of stone, Madam Speaker. They shouldn't be applied in a mechanical way. It would be madness to expect that such guidelines were so implied. And although the government remains committed to these guidelines, I was not misled, and I don't see why anybody should say I was.
One of a number of MPs who received letters from William Waldegrave about the guidelines.
For making that point clear. Erskine May, the standard authority on the conventions and procedures of this House, sets out a number of subjects on which successive administrations have declined to answer questions on grounds of public policy. These include, at present, discussions between ministers or between ministers and their official advisers, the proceedings of Cabinet or its committees, security matters, operational defence matters, and details of arms sales to particular countries. Here I come to the particular point that Sir Richard Scott has raised in relation to parliamentary questions on the sale of arms or defence-related equipment. He said that the long-standing practice should be re-examined. The government is content to do this, and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, has today placed in the library of the House a document setting out the current position in relation to informing Parliament on the export of arms, together with an explanation of how this practice has evolved. This is an important step forward, and I hope honourable members will find this document a useful basis on which to take the discussion forward. There are serious issues here. The government's policy on defence sales is based on a respect for the right of other countries and sovereign states to protect their independence and to exercise their right to self-defence, and this right is recognised explicitly by Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The countries to which we export arms have a legitimate right to maintain the confidentiality of the strength of their armed forces and the equipment they have available. Strategically, the export of defence equipment benefits our own defences through reducing the overall cost of equipment. At the same time, the export of defence equipment is beneficial to the health of the British economy. Total defence expenditure, including overseas sales of equipment, provides employment for more than 400,000 people in industry in this country. And our success in overseas defence markets also helps our much bigger and broader export trade in normal commercial goods. No one should understate the importance of jobs in considering these issues. But despite our economic interests, no, I have a lot of ground to cover. But despite our economic interests, this government maintains a strict policy on the control of defence exports, stricter than any other country, even though this involves denying to British firms valuable overseas markets involving not just the sale of weapons for defence, but also non-lethal equipment, potentially dual-purpose goods, and with a knock-on disadvantage to purely commercial civilian export opportunities, all of which our international competitors have no hesitation in exploiting. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend. He's determined to do justice to Sir Richard Scott. I have looked at the Franks report on the Falklands, a matter of war and peace. I have looked at the Aberfan inquiry involving the death of large numbers of school children. I have looked at a variety of other important recent tribunal reports, and all of them come out at less than 150 pages. Don't you think, doesn't the honourable gentleman think that the public might be entitled to feel that there's been a certain loss of a sense of proportion in all of this?
Well, Madam Speaker, it is not for me to judge the requisite length or content of a report. The government very carefully and deliberately gave Sir Richard Scott an entirely clear hand as to how she should go about preparing his report. But Sir Richard has recognised the potentially divergent and conflicting policy objectives in relation to employment and trade, as well as foreign policy and humanitarian considerations. These are conflicting issues with which all governments have to wrestle. Sir Richard himself recognises that the moral case for refusing to allow defence exports to a particular country has to be set against the damage to British economic interests. As the publication of the document placed in the library shows, the government is willing to play its part in public debate about the issues raised and would welcome the views of honourable members and others on this issue, including in particular those of the opposition parties. In the light of these comments, we will consider what changes might be made and bring forward any specific proposals for discussion in this House. Madam Speaker, on a further point on openness, before I turn to the report's other recommendations, I refer to the question of accountability, which has been raised in particular in relation to government agencies, on which the Public Service Select Committee is currently taking evidence. If that committee, currently undertaking an inquiry into these matters, were to be content to consider the question of accountability and responsibility more widely, the government would propose to submit its views on this issue to them. I hope the committee will be willing to take up this opportunity and in due course to put forward its considered proposals. Thus, in addition to being content that the Parliamentary Convention that the government does not answer questions about exports of arms and defence-related goods should be reviewed in the light of modern circumstances, as Sir Richard recommends, the government is also willing to consider positively Sir Richard Scott's wider views about ministerial accountability and responsibility, and I hope that the House will welcome these proposals. This approach is already in marked contrast to the approach of previous governments. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The Secretary of State said that this government has a long, well-established record of controlling arms exports. Why is it that on page 873 of the Scott report, it stated that only 7 out of 26 export licenses to Iraq were actually seen by Colonel Glazebrook in the Ministry of Defence? Is that the form of control that this government exercises?
Well, the control of the licenses lay in the approval of some 76,000 export license applications which came before the appropriate officials over the course of 1988-89. Madam Speaker, a further major step forward in making ministerial accountability transparent was taken by the Prime Minister in May 1992 when he decided to publish, as I've already mentioned, the guidance for ministers known as Questions of Procedure for Ministers. This has been a classified document under previous administrations. The section of Questions of Procedures for Ministers to which Sir Richard Scott refers says that ministers have the duty to give Parliament, including its select committees and the public, as full information as possible about the policies, decisions and actions of the government. There are and have long been a number of conventions and accepted reasons why full information cannot be made public and therefore cannot be given to Parliament. As Sir Richard says in his report, it is generally accepted, and rightly so, that there have always been and always will be some subjects in respect of which full information, or sometimes any information, cannot be given. These include, inter alia, matters that are sub judice, commercially confidential information, and sensitive security and foreign policy matters. And this is recognised now even by the Labour Party in their new guise of the advocates of open government. I am aware, of course, that concern about freedom of information derives in some cases from more genuine conviction than simple political opportunism. For example, my honourable friend, the member for Aldridge Brown Hills, has on numerous occasions set out his views on this issue, which I know he has held with consistency and with great sincerity.
Referring to Richard Shepherd.
Of a full-blown Freedom of Information Act is one that this government has had the opportunity to examine in considerable depth over several years, both in the context of responding to the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent's Right to Know Bill and in formulating our own Open Government White Paper in 1993. We have become persuaded as a result.
Order. I regret to interrupt. It seems to me that the Secretary of State at this stage is not willing to give way, and therefore members should be aware of that and should not persist at this time. Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, we have become persuaded as a result that this sort of approach, a Freedom of Information Act, is not the right way towards a fundamental opening up of government. Nor have recent events changed our view on this. The Honourable Member's Bill, together with all overseas countries' freedom of information regimes, exempted a number of classes of material from disclosure, including policy advice. And all of them tend to impose a legalistic approach which is more inflexible in its application, much more expensive to those who use it, and which risks undermining the role of Parliament and accountability to this House. And that is something about which I believe we should always be careful. But the debate over the alternatives should continue, and the government will be willing to participate.
Madam Speaker, the Minister or the Secretary of State is trying to distract the attention of the House from the issues of the culpability of ministers to a rather academic screed on accountability. Could he return to ministers and say what convention, what precedent is there for a minister remaining in office when, as Mr. Attorney, he has been found personally at fault by an official inquiry?
The honourable gentleman is quite wrong. I am not seeking to distract the House from the central issues of the report. Now that the two central charges levied by the party opposite have been disproved and dismissed as a result of this report, the essential underlying theme of the report is about openness and accountability to this House. These are deeply important issues which I believe the House rightly should have the opportunity to address. No, I will not give way to the honourable gentleman. I will...
Refusing to give way to Labour spokesman Robin Cook.
If he comes to that dispatch box to apologise for his behaviour in the past 3 years.
I have a point of order. I have a point.
Madam Speaker,
Order. I am trying to deal with the point of order.
Madam Speaker, the President referred to a paper that had been deposited in the library. We have just been advised that the paper in the library has been given an embargo until the President sits down.
That's referring to that paper from William Waldegrave.
Is it proper for the Minister to refer to a paper deposited in the library if that paper is not available to members calling at the library? And should not the President be willing for that paper to be circulated so he can be questioned on it while he's on his feet?
I must attempt to answer the point of order. No doubt the Secretary of State will give information to the House. All I would say in response to that point of order, it is entirely the responsibility of the Secretary of State what papers he puts in the library and what embargo he puts on them. But perhaps he can now enlighten the House as to how this matter.
Madam Speaker, I had no part in the placing of any embargo on that paper, and I would be entirely content for it to be available at once to members of the House. Madam Speaker, the Scott report makes important recommendations concerning the role of customs and excise, to which I said I would return. Lack of coordination and guidance here lay at the heart of some of the criticisms he makes on the way, with hindsight, the Matrix Churchill trial was pursued by customs and excise. It first addresses possible changes...
Order!
A number of Labour MPs have left the chamber to pick up that paper from the library, those notes from William Waldegrave, and the House getting quite excited now.
Order! There are no further points of order. The House must come to order to hear what the Secretary of State has to say. Yes, Mr. Pike.
It does appear that the document that is being referred to in the library is passing along the second bench on that side. That seems most inappropriate, Madam Speaker.
Not aware.
That was Peter Pike, Labour MP.
On this side. I am interested in what the Secretary of State is saying, as the House should be. Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker.
Another point of order, Nigel Spearing, Labour.
If the Secretary of State, having said that it would be content for members to get this, to tell us if in fact he has distributed it to the press or any media.
To the Secretary of State to give the information he wants to this.
I have distributed...
Have a further point of order. Order.
This is a document to nobody. As far as I'm concerned, it has been placed in the library and should have been placed at the beginning of my speech.
Order, Madam Speaker. I accept entirely the point made by the Secretary of State. But you yourself in your ruling indicated it is for the Minister to determine whether it should be embargoed or not. We are now in a situation where a document has been placed in the library available for members of this House. The Minister has indicated he has not put an embargo on it, but someone has put an embargo on it. Therefore, Madam Speaker, will you, as Protector of this House, find out exactly who is responsible for that embargo?
I'm certainly curious as to what embargo is placed on it and who has placed an embargo on it. I accept what the Secretary of State says, of course, that he himself has not placed an embargo on that paper.
Madam Speaker, I'm addressing the question of the Customs and Excise, and the report addresses possible changes to the Customs and Excise Management Act of 1979 to clarify the various powers and definitions. In addition to these and other specific legal provisions, Sir Richard Scott recommends a number of other changes to internal customs and excise procedures. As he recommends, there will be a review of the relationship between the Customs Solicitor's Office and the Customs Investigation Department. Sir Richard's recommendations relating to customs legislation and internal procedures are very largely accepted by the government, and we have asked for them to be implemented subject only to further consideration of some detailed technical legal matters. We will report back to the House on the changes that are being made once the implementation plans are finalised, and I hope that too will be welcome to the House. Now, I must make some progress. The report also considered the position of the Customs and Excise as an independent prosecuting authority, a role which has remained unchanged for very many years. It recommends the introduction of a formalised system of supervision by the Attorney General of export control prosecutions. At the same time, Sir Richard affirms the important constitutional principle that a prosecuting authority should be independent and free from political direction. He considers the analogy with the Crown Prosecution Service and the Director of Public Prosecutions, both of which are subject to the superintendence of the Attorney General, whereas the Customs and Excise Prosecuting Authority is not. Sir Richard notes that acting in this capacity, the Attorney General exercises a quasi-judicial role. His actions and decisions are not, for example, subject to Cabinet collective responsibility. Whilst the analogy Sir Richard draws with the Crown Prosecution Service and with the Serious Fraud Office is not an exact one, the government accepts that there are benefits in Sir Richard Scott's recommendation that in future, the role of the Attorney General should include the exercise of increased supervision of customs and excise prosecutions in relation to export control matters. I give way to my honourable learned friend.
Right, honourable friend, not accept that the customs and excise in this instance looked as if they were out of control and probably were, because they have no responsibility to anyone. Isn't it about time we got rid of the customs and excise and amalgamated it with the police so that they be subject to proper controls and the Crown Prosecution Service?
Well, Madam Speaker, that is not what Sir Richard Scott recommends, but it may be that the honourable gentleman will have my honourable friend will have an opportunity to advance his view in further consideration of this matter. The government is urgently developing proposals on the precise nature and scope of this increased supervision, and my honourable and learned friend will be reporting further to the House on this as soon as possible. In relation to the use of intelligence by government departments, Sir Richard makes it clear that he does not feel qualified to make recommendations as to how the various systems and procedures might be improved. He acknowledges that a number of improvements have been made and sets out a number of areas in which he considers that problems existed. Since 1992, Major reviews have taken place in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Department of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Defence and Customs and Excise. As a result, modern information technology systems have been introduced and new internal distribution arrangements have been adopted. In addition, the requirements of users are now more fully reflected in the intelligence gathering process. Sir Richard also makes a procedural recommendation which he has not published for security reasons concerning intelligence personnel, which will be discussed with the chairman of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee. The government would also propose to inform the Intelligence and Security Oversight Committee, chaired by my right honourable friend, the member for Bridgewater, of the other improvements which have been made. I have no doubt that this committee, which was specifically set up to deal with such matters, will want to satisfy itself and in due course to reassure the House that an adequate response has been made to Sir Richard Scott's observations. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Well, I'm grateful to the President of the Board of Trade. Can I congratulate him on accepting a number of the detailed recommendations of Sir Richard Scott? But could he explain to the House, if Sir Richard has come to the correct conclusion on all of these, why does the government believe that on the specific allegations in relation to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and to the Attorney General, Sir Nicholas has come to the wrong conclusion? Sir Richard has come to the wrong conclusion. Is that not a curious comparison?
Very curious, Madam Speaker, if the government did not exercise its judgment on all the recommendations and all the criticisms in Sir Richard Scott's report, and that is what we have done. And I turn now to prosecution procedures and public interest immunity. On the question of prosecution procedures, Sir Richard notes that the Criminal Procedure and Investigation Bill is before Parliament, and that his proposals in this area will have to be considered in the light of whatever legislation is eventually enacted. In relation to public interest immunity, he has made a range of detailed proposals. In relation to his report, the government is clear that the legal advice given by my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney General, was correct at the time of the Matrix Churchill and other trials. His view is supported by a range of decisions in the higher courts, and in addition, eminent lawyers, including a current law lord and the Master of the Rolls, have made clear their agreement with it. But Sir Richard's concluding chapter also focuses on suggestions for the future of this judge-made and evolving legal procedure. Yes, I go back to my honourable friend.
Is it not the case that there's been a wicked deception of the British people?
The Conservative Michael Stephen, waiting for Labour MPs to stop shouting before he continues.
Order, come along.
A wicked deception of the British people by the press and the broadcast media, who for the last 3 years have been referring to public interest immunity certificates as gagging orders, when they are no such thing, when the effect of a public interest immunity certificate is to bring the documents out of the archives of the government department, place them before the judge so that he can decide whether they should or should not be admitted.
My honourable friend is right, Madam Speaker, and the first point that I want to make on that subject is that the law has moved on significantly as a result of the House of Lords' decision in 1994 in Ex parte Wiley. This has had the effect of introducing already into current practice a number of the points now made by Sir Richard. As a result of that decision, ministers can now disclose PII documents without the prior approval of the court when they consider that this is in the overall public interest. The second point I should like to make clear. No, I'm not giving way at present. I've given way a great many times and I still have a lot of important information to divulge to the House. Madam Speaker, the second point that I should like to make clear is that contrary to the claims by the opposition, PII claims have been made in criminal cases both before the Matrix Churchill trial and since, and have been upheld in the courts. The abandonment of public interest immunity claims in criminal cases, which I understand the opposition propose, would result in cases against serious criminals and terrorists having to be dropped. This would be necessary, for example, to protect sensitive sources of information and those whose lives might otherwise be at risk. Moreover, PII does not only apply to government documents and to confidential police information, but also to the work of other agencies, such as the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in relation to child abuse cases. Madam Speaker, the law on public interest immunity in civil and criminal cases is made by the courts, and Sir Richard Scott does not believe that legislative intervention is necessary or at present desirable. But the government will consider his recommendations in the light of developing case law, in particular his views that the time is opportune for a collective reappraisal by ministers. As part of this consideration, the government would welcome views from honourable members and others on future developments in the use of public interest immunity certificates.
Will the President answer a question that I've been asked by a number of constituents? Why is it that the Attorney General refused to pull the prosecution to end the trial when he knew that Henderson was working for MI6? Because Scott says he could have done so.
Paul Henderson from Matrix Churchill.
My right honourable and learned friend, the attorney, and the trial was properly and fairly conducted. All the appropriate documents were placed before the judge. The judge commented on them that he was satisfied, and 3 defence counsels concluded that a fair and proper trial had taken place. Madam Speaker, the report devotes...
I have yet another point of order.
Madam Speaker, is it right for the President of the Board of Trade to assert to this House that it is not possible for the Attorney General to pull a trial, as it was put, when the actual situation is that it is the Attorney General and the Attorney General alone who has the right to stop criminal proceedings?
It is not a point of order, that is a point of argument.
Madam Speaker, the report devotes 2 chapters of recommendations to export control powers and licensing procedures. Before I come to these recommendations, I should like to cover, as I did in my statement, our policy regarding the export of defence equipment to Iran and Iraq. The government's policy was to remain neutral in the Iran-Iraq war.
Another point of order. Order, I have another point of order.
Madam Speaker, I wonder whether it would be possible for the Attorney General to come to the dispatch box to give a ruling on the point that I made and the point that was made by the Honourable Gentleman, because it's quite important and significant in this whole affair.
So a flurry of points of order during this debate.
The jury is capable of responding to the points that are being made.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I understand that points of order are for you, which is why I did not respond to it, but I'm sure that if the Honourable and Learned Gentleman catches your eye, he will pursue his point in the course of the debate. The government's policy, if my honourable friend will forgive me, I really must make progress. The government's policy was to remain neutral in the Iran-Iraq war. As Sir Richard recognises, no lethal weapons were sold to either side, and the government took vigorous measures to prevent the export of non-lethal goods, which could have prolonged or intensified the conflict. As the House knows, a set of guidelines was introduced to assist in the application of this policy, which was far stricter than that of our main international competitors. The guidelines were exactly that. They were for guidance, essentially for internal use, to assist officials in dealing with export licence applications. They had no legal basis and were not intended to set out the complete policy. As Sir Richard Scott acknowledges in his report, and I quote, "I would readily accept that in relation to defence sales to Iran and Iraq, the guidelines were not and were never intended to be an exclusive exposition of government policy." But yes, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful to the President. He's made it clear that the guidelines were not necessarily related specifically to policy, which was a different matter. Why is it then, in paragraph D43, Sir Richard quotes a letter written by ministers on 4 occasions, "The government have not changed the policy on defence sales to Iraq or Iran," when quite clearly, does he not agree, all the evidence showed that they had?
No, I don't accept the honourable gentleman's point. And on this question of guidelines, let me quote to him the author of a different guide on guidelines, who said, and I quote, they must not be allowed by an over-rigid application that fails to take into account the circumstances of each case to become a constraint on effective and sensible case management. Now, Madam Speaker, those are the words not of myself or the government. Those are the words in a preface to the Chancery Guide written by Sir Richard Scott himself. But the point that I am making is that ministers and officials in all three departments believed, and Sir Richard Scott accepts, that they were applying the government's policy on the export of defence equipment in a way that remained within the guidelines announced by the then Foreign Secretary in 1985 with all their inherent flexibility. While honest opinions can and do differ...
Order. I think it's a point of frustration, but I'll hear it.
A point of order, Madam Speaker. The Secretary of State has been on his feet for 37 minutes. Support for our parliamentary democracy is ebbing away, hemorrhaging away in this country every second he speaks. Will you, Madam Speaker, direct him to answer the main charges of Scott before it's too late?
It's not a point of order.
Madam Speaker, I think the central tenet of our parliamentary democracy is freedom of speech. I have given way many times in this debate. I have a great deal of information to lay before the House, and I wish to do so that the debate can then continue. But the point that I am making is that ministers and officials in all three departments believe...
Order. The honourable gentleman must resume his seat. The Secretary of State has indicated he's not giving way at the moment.
Labour MP Gerald Kaufman is trying to intervene at the moment.
Officials in all three departments believed, and Sir Richard Scott accepts that they were...
I have yet another point of order.
The right honourable gentleman gave way to my honourable friend, the member for Newham, and purported to give a response to my honourable friend in which he deliberately misinformed the House. It is essential that the House have a chance...
Order. I'm sure the honourable gentleman will seek to rephrase precisely what he's now saying. I'm sure he will do so. Order.
Yes, Madam Speaker, of course I will rephrase it in response to what you say. The right honourable gentleman gave a response to my honourable friend in which he will have misinformed the House unless he allows that to be corrected by giving way to me.
The parliamentary debate is made of. Thank you.
Well, Madam Speaker, I will look forward to listening to the right honourable gentleman's speech. But as I have...
Gerald Kaufman trying again to intervene. He obviously wants to pursue his point further.
As I've said, Madam Speaker, we will be placing a document in the House that sets out our current approach to informing Parliament about our policy on arms sales, and in the light of comments we receive, we will bring forward any specific proposals for discussion in the House. And I am also placing in the library a note on how this policy operated between 1980 and 1990. I return now, Madam Speaker, to Sir Richard Scott's recommendations on export controls. The Government accepts that the current export control powers and procedures should be reviewed and that there should be wide consultation in the course of such a review. This review will take into account the points made by the report. We will then produce a consultation paper covering these points, as Sir Richard Scott recommends. I should make it clear at this stage that the Government is committed to an export control system which is easy for business to use and understand, yet which allows the Government to take restraining action where this is necessary for wider policy reasons. I'm sure the House will approve progress in this area. But, Madam Speaker, it is important to put the issue of defence equipment sales and the operation of these guidelines in a clear perspective. Let it not be forgotten that the whole debate on guidelines is not about the sale of arms, such as guns, missiles, bullets and bombs, but about non-lethal defence equipment. Moreover, the issue is not about the sale of such equipment by government, but about the steps taken by government to control sales by manufacturers and others to unacceptable destinations. And the details of the export licenses to Iraq in the crucial years have all been published. I invite the House to contrast this with the policies pursued by Labour governments in the 1960s and the 1970s. Then the issue was not about non-lethal equipment, but about the sale of lethal weapons. And it was not about the government controlling such sales. The government actually helped to do the selling. In 1966, the Ministry of Defence, under the then Secretary of State for Defence, now the noble Lord Healy, set up its own defence sales organisation, tasked not with the control of overseas defence sales, as this government's guidelines have sought to do, but with the specific purpose, amongst others, of actually organising sales campaigns and presentations, of negotiating major deals, deals, be it noted, not in spare parts for microprocessors or field telephones, but for lethal weapons. And to what countries do we find the Labour government directed its sales campaigns? Madam Speaker, I have done a little research, and I find that in the years 1975, 1976 and 1977, during the run-up to the Iran-Iraq war, British defence sales to Iran averaged over £50 million a year, including sale of lethal weapons. But still more interesting is the record of the last Labour government at the same time to another country, Argentina. I have discovered that the last Labour government helped to secure contracts to sell to Argentina, again, not a country renowned at the time, either for its democracy or for its human rights record, such choice consignments as 42 Sea Dart surface-to-air missiles, 120 blowpipe surface-to-air missiles, and 2 Lynx helicopters. These are not spares for radar sets or metal detectors, Madam Speaker. These are weapons of war sold to the Argentine dictatorship. And if we go back a little further, we find Labour governments selling to Argentina 2 Type 42 destroyers and direct at their own hand 8 Canberra bombers. So there we have it, Madam Speaker. Destroyers, missiles, helicopters and bombers. Don't fly for me, Argentina. Lethal weapons sold direct by a Labour government. And isn't this the real contrast between Labour and ourselves, Madam Speaker? In the Gulf War against Iraq, British forces risked facing no British weapons in the hands of the enemy. But in the Falklands War against Argentina, they did. There can surely be no more sickening example of hypocrisy than this, of Labour saying one thing and doing another. Now there remains, Madam Speaker, the unfinished business of the honourable member for Livingston, who is shown by the Scott report to have systematically misled the House and the country over 3 years.
Referring to Robin Cook.
That we secretly conspired to arm Saddam Hussein with lethal weapons, and that we gagged the courts to suppress the evidence and let innocent...
I have a point of order.
Right. As I heard it, the right honourable gentleman has accused my honourable friend, the member for Livingston, of having misled the House. If that is so, then surely he is culpable.
If there wasn't so much noise, we could all hear precisely what is being said. Is it a fact that the Secretary of State used those words?
Yes, it is,
Order!
Madam.
I want to hear the Secretary of State, not the opposition.
Yes, it is, Madam Speaker, and if you rule that as unparliamentary, I will withdraw misled the House, but I will leave in place misled the country, because for 3 years the honourable gentleman went around this country accusing this government of secretly arming Saddam Hussein and of attempting to gag the courts.
The convention is you can't accuse another MP of lying.
Completely rejected by the report, and he now tries vindictively and contemptibly to shift his ground in order to continue this odious smear campaign. He shows a standard of behaviour that renders him unfit to be trusted either by this House or by any foreign country, even in the shadow post of Foreign Secretary. And the House continues to await and demand an apology. Madam Speaker, the government welcomes its acquittal by the Scott report of the 2 very serious charges that caused it to be set up. We accept, as I have said today, and indeed in my statement 10 days ago, that there have been mistakes, there have been shortcomings, there is a need for improvement in several areas, and today I have mapped out a number of ways in which the House can proceed. I have done so in a positive and forward-looking spirit. recognising that long-established conventions and practices of this House and elsewhere need to be looked at in a fresh light. I invite the House to respond in that spirit and to support the government in the lobby tonight.
Madam Speaker, I shall respond in a moment to the Right Honourable Gentleman's purple peroration. First, let me comment on the announcements he's made today. It need not detain the House for long, because the length of the passage in the Right Honourable Gentleman's speech cannot conceal the shortness and specifics in those proposals. Let me respond on 3 points. First of all, we welcome that the customs are to have supervision of their prosecuting role. I have to say, in the light of the grave criticisms by Sir Richard Scott of the conduct of the Matrix Churchill trial, it would have been astonishing if the Right Honourable Gentleman had not proposed changes to the prosecuting role of the customs. Secondly, I would agree with the government that we require a review of ministerial accountability. After all, it is one of the key conclusions in the closing section of this report that in the course of this inquiry, example after example has come to light of the failure of ministerial accountability. What I do find surprising is that now, having had 18 days to study the report, the Right Honourable Gentleman still could produce no proposal as to what might be done to strengthen ministerial accountability. The one initiative he announced today was that if the Select Committee holds an inquiry into ministerial accountability, the government will give evidence. Really? I would hope so. It is, after all, their duty to give evidence to Select Committees if they're asked to do so. But it doesn't shed any light on what single proposal they will make in that evidence to avoid us ever again having to debate a report which in its closing chapter details 7 specific cases when ministerial accountability was broken. Thirdly, let me just finish this point and then I will certainly give way to it. We shall certainly consider the government's paper on parliamentary questions on arms exports. I will give way to it. Relax. This time will come. I have the paper that's been deposited in the library in front of me. I perhaps should share with the House, who may not have a chance to look at it, the conclusion. This note summarises the position in relation to the release of information on defence-related exports and has been prepared in order to assist further discussion on this subject. Not a single proposal in the document. Now, I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, we shall try to enter the spirit of this discussion as fully as we may, but it would have assisted discussion still further if they had one single idea to offer to the House.
Right Honourable Gentlemen agree that it would be extremely difficult to lay down any rules for ministerial accountability, because essentially it's a question for the House and a question as to how much the House wants information. For instance, as far as negotiations with the IRA were concerned before the ceasefire, the House certainly came to a misunderstanding as to the state of discussions between the government and the IRA. But yet when the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland came to this House, the House was very pleased to accept a slightly changed expression of those relationships. And that is an example, is it not, of how the House decides what information it wants.
I will return at a later stage of my speech as to whether or not... I'm going to answer the honourable member. I will return at the latest point in my speech as to whether or not it is justifiable at any stage not to share information with the House, and in this particular occasion, whether it was justified. But I do have to say to the honourable member that I cannot accept for one moment his claim that it is impossible to make any rules on ministerial accountability. Indeed, this government keeps issuing rules on ministerial accountability. And indeed, it is precisely those rules which in Chapter 8 of Section K, Sir Richard Scott states, paragraph 27 of Questions of Procedure for Minister, identifies as one of the facets of ministerial accountability the duty to give Parliament, including its select committees and the public, as full information as possible about the policies, decisions and actions of the government, and not to deceive or to mislead Parliament. And that is where Sir Richard Scott, whom the honourable members appointed to judge on this point, he was their choice, it was their decision of the inquiry, and it was at that point that Sir Richard Scott says, in the course of the inquiry, example after example has come to light of an apparent failure of ministers to discharge that accountability. Now, Madam Speaker, if I may say so, the right honourable gentleman. No, I'll give way in a moment. I'll give way. I could not resist giving way to the honourable member, but let me finish with his right honourable friend. The right honourable gentleman's commitment to openness was a lot less convincing when he then ruled out a Freedom of Information Act. It was secrecy that made this scandal possible. The 5 volumes of the Scott Report provide the firmest foundation yet of the case for a Freedom of Information Act. And I have to say to the honourable members on the Treasury bench, there were never better witnesses for a Freedom of Information Act than the long parade of officials and ministers queuing up to explain to Sir Richard Scott that the public interest was best served by not letting the public know what they were deciding. I'll give way to the honourable member.
Does the honourable gentleman accept that those who seek to hold members of the government accountable must expect to be held accountable themselves? Is the honourable gentleman aware that in this House on the 23rd of November 1992, the honourable gentleman said this: first, they armed Saddam. Secondly, when he used those arms against the British ally, they covered up the fact that they had provided the arms. And thirdly, as the cover-up unravelled, rather than own up, they were willing to see the 3 executives of Matrix Churchill go to prison. Is the honourable gentleman aware that not a word of that is true, and will he now withdraw it?
No, the honourable member is wrong on every single count. And I shall demonstrate in the speech before me how every single one of those charges were justified. But I do have to say to the right honourable gentleman, he has echoed the allegation of his honourable friend. What made the speech of the right honourable gentleman so remarkable was the absence of any acceptance by any minister for any responsibility of the errors set out in this report. Confronted with these errors and 5 volumes of supporting evidence, the right honourable gentleman, his honourable friend, have produced the novel constitutional principle that it is the duty of the opposition to accept responsibility and to resign. And every time they produce it, there is a wave of hilarity across the nation that drowns them. This is a government. This is a government. This is a government. I will answer the question. I will answer the question. This is a government which is fond of lecturing the rest of the nation on its need to accept responsibility. Parents are held responsible for actions. Teachers are held responsible for the performance of their pupils. Local councillors are held legally and financially responsible. Yet when it comes to themselves, suddenly, not a single minister can be found to accept responsibility for what went wrong. To listen to the honourable gentleman. No, I will deal with the honourable.
David Mellor trying to intervene again, but Robin Cook refusing.
No, I'm going to answer the honourable gentleman, and he is not going to like the answer. Because over the past week, a number of honourable and right honourable gentlemen, of which he is only the latest, have expressed their version of Labour's charges against the government. I have no doubt they were trying to be helpful, and I'm grateful to them for their assistance. I hope they'll forgive me if I rely on the charges the opposition actually made, because they were all set out. Yes, they were all set out in that debate. They were in that motion I moved 3 years ago on the last occasion the House debated the issue. And there were 4 charges, not 3, there were 4. And I will deal with each of those 4 charges. And I shall today demonstrate, as Sir Richard Scott's report convicts the government on every one of them. The first of the charge in our motion was, and I quote, that the government had acted in clear breach of the Howe Guidelines of 1985. Sir Richard returns a verdict of guilty. You can tell, Madam Speaker, the importance he attaches to the conclusion, because, like all his key findings, it is expressed as a double negative. It is clear that policy and defence sales to Iraq did not remain unchanged. Indeed, Sir Richard reserves the most scathing passages in his report for those witnesses who tried to argue that the guidelines had not changed. The Chief Secretary submitted that the guidelines were not changed, but were only interpreted more flexibly. Sir Richard dismisses his view as one that does not seem to me to correspond with reality. For good measure, Sir Richard quotes a minute which says, Mr. Waldegrave is content for us to implement a more liberal